Scots are the people native to Scotland, with a rich history and distinct cultural heritage. Scots who settled in Northern Ireland are known as Ulster Scots, and they have their own unique history and traditions. While most Scottish people speak English, two traditional languages are also spoken: Scots, a Germanic language closely related to English, and Scottish Gaelic, a Celtic language primarily used in the Highlands and Western Isles. The population of Scottish people is just over 5 million in the British Isles, with the majority of these people living in Scotland. Worldwide, there are tens of millions of people of Scottish ancestry, and the countries with population of Scottish heritage include the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The Scottish people are the result of thousands of years of migration and cultural mixing. In prehistoric times, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers were the first to settle after the last ice age. They were followed by Neolithic farmers from continental Europe. During the Bronze Age, populations with steppe-related ancestry arrived. By the Iron Age, Celtic-speaking communities were established across much of Scotland. In the Middle Ages, Picts dominated the north and east, while Gaelic-speaking settlers from Ireland founded Western kingdoms. The south was dominated by Iron Age Britons. Norse Vikings settled the northern and western Isles, and Angles and Anglo-Normans moved into the southeast. During the Mesolithic period, Scotland was inhabited by a hunter-gatherer population, which was genetically related to Western hunter-gatherers. This population was characterized by relatively dark skin and blue eyes. Moving into the Neolithic, Scotland saw the arrival of agriculturalists from continental Europe who eventually absorbed the hunter-gatherer population, which led to significant genetic changes. These farmers introduced agriculture and brought genes for lighter skin pigmentation. They were, however, quickly replaced by immigrants from the Bell-Beaker culture. These newcomers brought steppe ancestry, which led to a major population replacement in a relatively short period. The Iron Age ushered in various cultural and social transformations, including the spread of Celtic languages, but saw relatively little large-scale genetic migration compared to earlier eras. The Picts were an ancient group of tribal people who inhabited what we now know as northern and eastern Scotland during the late Roman period and the early Middle Ages. They first popped up in Roman writings around 297 CE, where they were referred to as Picti, which translates to painted ones. This name likely alluded to their use of body paint or tattoos. The Picts primarily lived in small farming communities and depended on agriculture and livestock for their livelihood. They managed to fend off Roman conquest and maintained their independence for centuries. However, as time went on, they gradually blended into Gaelic culture during the wider Gaelicization that began in the late 9th century, leading to the fading of their language and unique identity as the Kingdom of Alba took shape. Gaelicization in Scotland kicked off when the Scoti, or Gaels, made their way from Ireland to Dalriada, a kingdom that spanned parts of what we now know as Western Scotland and northeastern Ireland, around the 5th to 6th century CE. These Gaels were a Celtic-speaking group hailing from Ireland. They brought with them the Gall-Gàidheil language, which eventually evolved into Scottish Gaelic, along with their social systems, laws, and traditions. Over time, Gaelic culture and language flourished, especially in the western coastal areas of Scotland. The Gaelic language and its culture became deeply intertwined with the monarchy and governance. By the late medieval period, however, Gaelic was mostly limited to the Highlands and the Western Isles. The Britons mainly settled in Strathclyde, which was centred around the River Clyde Valley, along with regions we now call Dumfries and Galloway, southern Ayrshire, and parts of the Scottish borders. To the south, their neighbours stretched into Cumbria and northern England. They communicated in a Brythonic language and had strong cultural and political ties with northern England and Wales. However, By the 8th and 9th centuries, their influence started to decline due to pressure from the Scots, Picts, and Vikings. After the Battle of Carham in 1018, Strathclyde's territories began to be integrated into the Scottish kingdom, leading to a gradual loss of political independence. Linguistically, Cumbric, the Brittonic language spoken in southern Scotland, lingered for a few centuries before being overtaken by Scots and English. The Viking Age in Scotland was a fascinating time that kicked off in the late 8th century and lasted until the 13th century. During the 9th century, Norse raiders evolved from sporadic plundering to organized conquests and settlements. In 839 AD, the Norse force navigated up rivers into central Pictland, where it defeated several local kings and threw the established Pictish system into chaos. After this wave of raids, the Norse began to set up permanent homes, especially in the northern and western Isles. By the mid-9th century, places like Shetland, Orkney, the Hebrides, and parts of the mainland, including Caithness and Sutherland, were firmly under Norse control. The earldom of Orkney became particularly influential, acting as a Norse stronghold from which they extended their reach into nearby islands and coastal areas. Norse settlers established villages, adapted to their new surroundings, and gradually intermarried with the local populations. This blending of cultures resulted in unique communities, like the Norse Gaelic groups or Gall-Gàidheil found in the Hebrides and the Irish Sea region. As we moved into the 12th and 13th centuries, the power dynamics began to shift. Scottish kings grew bolder, challenging Norse supremacy in the west and negotiating control over territories. A key moment in this struggle was the Battle of Largs in 1263, where Scottish forces successfully confronted a Norwegian fleet led by King Haakon IV, which signaled the decline of Norse military power. Not long after, the Treaty of Perth in 1266 officially marked the end of significant Norse rule over most of the Hebrides and the Isle of Man, Orkney and Shetland, however, remained under Norse, and later Danish-Norwegian, control until they were pledged to Scotland in 1468-1469. Anglo settlers founded Bernicia, an Anglian kingdom that once ruled over parts of what we now know as northeastern England and southeastern Scotland. At its peak, Bernicia stretched from the River Tees in the south all the way up to the Firth of Forth in the north, encompassing areas like Berwickshire and East Lothian in present-day southeastern Scotland. Before the Angles arrived, the region was home to Brythonic peoples, who shared cultural and linguistic ties with the Britons of Strathclyde and Wales. This area was part of what Welsh traditions refer to as a hen Ogleth, the Old North. In the early 7th century, Bernicia joined forces with its southern neighbour, Deira, to create the larger kingdom of Northumbria. By the late 10th century, often associated with a grant in 973 but likely the result of a gradual transition, Scottish control over northern Bernicia, Lothian, was acknowledged, a change that was solidified after the Battle of Carham in 1018, signalling the end of prolonged Anglo-Saxon dominance in the region. The Anglo-Normans, unlike the tribes that came before them, didn't just conquer Scotland. They actually sparked a significant change in Scottish society, all while under the rule of native kings who were influenced by Anglo-Norman England. One of the key figures in this transformation was David I of Scotland, who brought in the concept of feudal landholding inspired by what he saw in Anglo-Norman England. Having spent time at the court of King Henry I, David was quite taken with these governance practices. This period of change in Scotland is often referred to as the Davidian Revolution. To help solidify their influence, Anglo-Norman knights and nobles were invited to settle in Scotland, receiving land in return for their military service. Notable families of Anglo-Norman descent, like the Bruces, Balliols, and Stuarts, rose to prominence as powerful Scottish lords. The arrival of Anglo-Norman merchants and craftsmen also gave a boost to the economy, linking Scotland to broader European markets. Their skills in administration and military affairs played a crucial role in modernising Scottish governance. However, by the 13th century, tensions began to rise between Scotland and England. If we talk about genetics, modern Scottish people largely descend from the same populations that lived in the region during the Iron Age. The Picts weren't a completely separate group but rather a local variation of these earlier inhabitants. People from Orkney and Shetland stand out a bit because of significant Norse ancestry introduced during the Viking period. Over time, groups like the Gaels, Angles, and Anglo-Normans also added to the genetic mix, but they didn't replace the existing population. Overall, modern Scots are genetically most similar to the Irish, Welsh, and people from northern England.